In today's podcast, we speak to Dave and Simon, both who have spinal injuries and now use a wheelchair, to find out about their lived experiences. Both work for the Spinal Injuries Association, a wonderful organisation that TED Learning has had the privilege of working with. So Dave, Simon, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Hello to both of you.
Hi, nice to see you.
Great to see you.
So when did you both begin using a wheelchair, and how did this immediately affect your lives?
I had an illness back in 2008, which attacked my nervous system, and after a long time in hospital and being in a coma and intensive care and stuff like that, the net result was that I had damaged my spinal cord at T10 level, which is tummy button level. So I'm paralyzed from the waist down, and for a long time, I really hated my wheelchair. It just was a symbol of all the things that had gone to hell in my life. Even though without it, I was literally stuck in bed, could go nowhere. And it took a little while for me to sort of come to terms with the fact that actually my wheelchair had just become my new best friend, because it enabled me to do the things I wanted to do. And I think one of the things that I have realized is that equipment like a wheelchair is an enabler. It replaces my legs. It means I can do all the things I want to do, however big, small, or stupid they are. So that was where I sort of came to with wheelchairs, and as I say, that was 15 years ago
now. For me, I'm a couple of years behind Dave. My spinal cord injury was 13 years ago, when I slightly more conventionally had made a stupid mistake and stepped out in front of the vehicle when I wasn't paying attention and broke my spine at T7. So I'm slightly higher up than Dave. Mine's at, we're going to use body parts. Mine's at about nipple level. And I have, kind of a very similar experience to Dave. I remember my spinal injury was in the October. So I was in spinal center over Christmas. And I remember lying in my hospital bed on Christmas Day when the family had been, and the wheelchair that had been allocated to me by the hospital at that time as a newbie was what I would look at now and compare to the one that I use day to day as a tank. And I remember lying in bed on Christmas Day, which is, when you're supposed to be enjoying yourself, looking at that wheelchair beside my bed and thinking to myself, that's your life now. And at that point, I had no idea how challenging it was going to be. And I know we'll talk about the challenges later. But for me, the challenge was just actually maneuvering this thing without colliding with beds, patients, nurses, doors, lifts, and actually being able to as I progressed through my rehab, being able to carry a drink or some food to a table, something that you take for granted when you're in a cafe, something like that. And I began to hate the fact that I had to rely on people, certainly initially, rely on people more than I particularly wanted to.
And how did it affect your mental well-being when this happened to you?
It's a bit like the change curve. My mental health took a real dip in terms of I began to feel very, very conscious. Started off certainly feeling very self-conscious of the chair and hating myself for the stupidity that had put me there. And a bit like Dave said earlier, ultimately you begin to realize that unless you embrace that and accept it as your new best friend, to use Dave's phrase, you're not going to get anywhere. So you do then start to accept that change, or I certainly did anyway, and then began to find that as not as a bind, but as a means to freedom. I could actually then get out of the hospital doors and actually get some fresh air and ultimately go down to the pub And that's what quite a lot of us quite enjoy on a Friday night. Who wouldn't want to do that? So yeah. And the good thing about it is it means when you do go to the pub, you've always got a seat. But anyway.
Absolutely. And Dave, what about you? How did it affect your well-being, your mental well-being, when you first had to start using a chair?
It was quite interesting for me because, as I say, it took me a while to come to terms with it, even though I was pushing around in it. I think one of the things that really confused me was I didn't properly understand about the nature of spinal cord injury. And it's probably worth making that distinction now because, I'm a full-time wheelchair user. I get out of bed into my wheelchair and I'm in it for the rest of the day. And I take it everywhere with me. And I take it, if I'm driving, then it comes with me and so on and so on. And Simon's the same, full-time chair user. But a lot of people aren't with a spinal cord injury because spinal cord injury is a very complex and not very well understood condition. There was a consultant at Stoke Mandeville at the Spinal Centre there, which is a specialist rehab setting, who had a notice on his door saying that spinal cord injury is like a snowflake because every single one is different. And I didn't get that to begin with. I thought everyone was going to be like me. And then I was looking around and I realized that there were some people who had a level of injury that was higher up their body. And so it had impacted on their hands and their arm function. And so they were using power chairs to get around. And then I remember being down at the gym playing basketball, again, as part of the whole rehab. And somebody stood up to take a shot. So this is a person with a spinal cord injury, and we are playing wheelchair basketball. And they stood up to take a shot. And I just thought, well, hang on. First of all, that's cheating. And second of all, how the hell do you do that? And it's because the nature of their injury is that the damage to their spinal cord isn't completely across the whole of the cord. So they still have partial sensation and movement and so on. And so they're part-time wheelchair users. They use wheelchairs to get around and to save energy, but they can, in some instances, still stand, still walk, still mobilize. And I won't use the exact words I thought at that moment in time because, this is a family show. But I certainly was questioning. It made me think that I wasn't doing my rehab properly, that I wasn't working hard enough to get better because I hadn't connected that I wasn't going to get better because there is no cure for spinal cord injury. And ironically, it was a guy from the Spinal Injuries Association, which is a national charity that supports people who've damaged their spinal cord. He was the first person who really connected with me and helped me understand that I wasn't going to walk again and that I could flog myself stupid in the gym, but I'm not going to get better. Because my idea of getting better was to walk out of the rehab unit, and that was my goal. And he really helped with my understanding, and that had a big impact on my mental health, which started to come back up, and I became more positive in the way I was approaching everything, instead of being quite negative and quite sort of self-destructive in terms of how hard I was working to get better and so on. So the impact on mental health is quite interesting, but I think mine improved when I understood more about spinal cord injury. Just as simple as that, really. And the fact that it is a very complex condition, but not all of us are full-time wheelchair users. There's a real spectrum of the amount of functional ability that people have.
Personal experience, as you both know, my father lost his leg to cancer last year, so now has to use a wheelchair to get around. But as you just described with the basketball game, he can still stand up with his leg, he can still use crutches to get around. But day to day, the majority of his access is with wheelchairs. So could you just describe a sort of a typical day for you as a wheelchair user? So what's the difference for somebody who's using a wheelchair versus someone who's not?
Yeah, how long have we got? I think one of the main things that I find is the length of time it takes to do anything. For those without a spinal cord injury, the alarm goes off, you leap out of bed and straight into the shower. Well, leaping out of bed's not going to happen for a start. But there's then sort of, waking up, sitting yourself up, and, disentangling legs from duvets and making sure that they're all in the right position. Putting something on your feet to stop your feet getting bruised or cut or anything like that on the foot plate of the wheelchair. Transferring into the wheelchair, pushing into the bathroom, then perhaps transferring onto a shower seat within the shower. By this time, most normal people or non-disabled people will have had their shower and be dressed and thinking about whether they're going to have coffee or tea with their toast and what they're going to put on it. My partner describes the sort of morning stuff and the routine, the way that things, the length of time it takes. She said, it's really nice going out with somebody in a wheelchair because he takes longer to get ready than I do. And coming from a woman, that's quite a statement, he said, making sweeping generalizations. But I think that's one of the main things for me is the length of time it takes to do anything. And you have to build that into your day. Because, I mean, Dave's already alluded to it. We're both full-time wheelchair users. Everything we do, you have to think about what you're going to do, with the wheelchair, whether it's putting a lap tray on to carry food around, and rather than, you can't do two things at once. You can't hold a drink in your hand and a plate of toast and move your wheelchair. It has to be put it onto a lap and then be careful about what you're going to bump over so that the tea doesn't spill everywhere. And there's all those sorts of considerations. No longer do I jump into the car and dash off down to the shops. It's it's a couple of minutes process to get the chair and me into the car. Somebody once said, how do you learn to do it so quickly? And my response was immediate, which was go and do it in the rain, because then you don't hang about, because otherwise you've got a wet seat that you've got to put your backside on for the rest of the day. But a typical day will be about thinking about what I've got to do and just forward planning things a bit and building a lot more time into my day for doing things. Dave, I don't know what you would add to
I mean,
that.
I think, Simon and I both work full time, both have family responsibilities and so on. So actually, to a certain extent, our days are very much like everyone else's. We're quite normal people, whatever we look like or sound like. But, a friend of ours once described being spinal cord injured, being a wheelchair user, as like having a full-time job. And that's on top of the current full-time 35 hours a week job that we both have. So what that means is that, yes, everything takes longer. You get very good at forward planning. You become exceptional at lateral thinking, at problem solving, because you just have to. Things will happen, and you'll drop something on the floor and it will roll somewhere you can't reach it. And if you're in the house alone, it either is staying there till somebody comes home, or you're going to find a way of getting it. I remember not long after I came home, I was home alone, and I realized that my wife had moved the biscuit tin onto a high shelf to stop my 18-month-old son constantly reaching up and grabbing it. And so I'm looking at this biscuit tin, which is about 2 feet above my head as a wheelchair user. And I started to problem solve how I was going to get this thing down, because I wanted a biscuit. And I should be able to have a biscuit in my own house without asking for help. And in the end, I used a bread knife, and I reached up and got the bread knife under the lip of the tin, pulled the thing towards me, caught the biscuit tin as it fell down, managed not to cut my wrists at the same time with said bread knife. But I also found I could put it back, just doing that process in reverse. And that was kind of nice, because it took my wife ages to work out who was eating the biscuit, because she thought it was my son, and it wasn't, it was me. And so you get very good at that sort of lateral thing, but that takes time. Everything takes time. Spinal cord injured people, it's a very physical way of living. We're pushing around all the time instead of walking. And, arms and shoulders aren't really designed for that. So every day feels like it's another 12 hours in the gym, alongside the fact that everything takes longer, alongside all the problem solving. So it makes it makes each day a little bit of a challenge. And I have come to embrace that. There was a time when that was a pain in my backside, but I now embrace it as this is part and parcel of my life. How am I going to solve this next crisis, this next problem? Um, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I do keep that concept of the biscuits tin in the back of my mind as one of the times when I was home alone and solved a problem with style.
So there was some real determination there, wasn't there? And
I
it
was
sounds
hungry.
you were hungry, but it also sounds like the mindset was really important for both of you, because you both described those very early days when you both experienced the spinal injury damage that you incurred, and then that point where you realized that that was your way of living now, and that mindset change. And I saw that in my own dad as well. Was that important for you both to have that realization?
Once you've come to grips with that, or you've accepted that, that's the point at which you can start to move forward and start thinking about the forward planning and thinking, okay, for me, my coping mechanism is a bit sort of, I compartmentalize things, and I kind of put that into a box, and my attitude very quickly became, well, this isn't like something I brought from Argos, and I've got a 28-day receipt. If I take it back within 28 days, I can say, do you know what, actually I don't like this, can I have it back the way it was? And because that's not going to happen. And it's been said by a lot of people that sustaining a spinal cord injury is a bit like grief. You have to grieve for your old way of life, as you do when a loved one dies. And over time, you will begin to accept that they're not there, in the same way that I have grown to accept that I won't walk again, or grew to accept, not have grown. I've kind of got that message now. I know that's not going to happen. And it's from that point that you can begin to think about how you move forward and just getting on with life. And both Dave and I think, and I know Dave well enough to we've both got a similar outlook and attitude that, okay, it's not going to change. Let's crack on. And we've both gone on and done things. I think it's fair to say we've both done things that we would not have done if it wasn't for the fact that we had a spinal cord injury. So I can look back now over the last 13 years and take a lot of positives out of it. Apart from anything else, neither of us would be working where we're working. But there's loads and loads of other things that we've done, far too numerous to mention and bore people with. But have had some fantastic opportunities, and as I say, done things that I wouldn't have done without it.
I think for me, the other thing is that I didn't know how resilient I was, how resilient I am. And so, you kind of have to hit the bottom to sort of bounce and start coming back up the other way. And, we all go through experiences in life which test us and which mean that we need to use that resilience to sort of grow and come out the other side. I mean, you were talking about your father, for example, Justin, and having his leg amputated. And I think that whether it's spinal cord injury or an amputation or cancer or a heart attack or whatever it is, we all have far more levels of resilience than I think that we realize. And then when you go mining in there and you go looking for that, you find strength that you didn't know that you have. And I think for me as well, I would just add to that spinal cord injury doesn't just happen to the individual, to me. It happens, my wife was just as affected, or as affected in a similar but different ways. My mum, my sisters, it's a ripple effect that goes out when you throw a stone in a pond and it sort of spreads out from there. And we know that that spinal cord injury affects more than just the individual, and so you need the people around you to be resilient as well. And to a certain extent, I think my family took the lead from me on that when they saw how I was responding and trying to deal with it, and particularly after I started to come to terms with it, it it sort of rubbed off a bit on them, and we all started bouncing back, rather than being stuck in the depths of despair.
And how do people typically react when they meet you for the first time and discover that you're a wheelchair user? So, for example, although we're recording a podcast today, I can see both of you on screen. I would not know from the screen that either of you were wheelchair users. So, that could be perhaps a surprise if I wasn't aware of that. What sort of reactions do you get from people? And second part to the question, is there anything that you wish that they did or understood better when they first met you?
It's been touched on previously, but it's around that, I know how you feel because I broke my leg and I had to use a wheelchair for for a matter of weeks. And yeah, okay. But yeah, you needed to use the wheelchair and somebody to push you, probably pushed you around. But when you got to where you wanted to get to, you could stand up and walk around. Or if there was a step, you could have probably got out of the wheelchair, used some crutches, got up the step, and then somebody carried the wheelchair in for you. It's things like that. I think Dave and I will both just probably smile quite sweetly and accept that. There are some people who are less magnanimous in their acceptance of it. But I think the main reaction is that what people don't appreciate with the spinal cord injury in particular, they see that you're in a wheelchair and they assume that it's just your legs that don't work. There's a whole load of other stuff that you don't see. There's bowel management, there's bladder management, there's skin management, there's loss of sexual function, there's all of those sorts of things. Now, obviously, they're not the sort of things that you would discuss first off with somebody when you've just bumped into them in the street or first met them. Because obviously the wheelchair and the lack of physical movement of the legs is quite stark and quite obvious. And I think sometimes people do forget that, let's ignore the bowel, bladder and skin issue. It is only the legs that don't work. Both of us have got reasonably active and intelligent brains that we still use. And some people do seem to think that your leg's not working means that you've got other impairments as well. And I think that's the important thing for people to remember, is that there is still a human being, and in the vast majority of cases, an intelligent and compos mentis human being in that chair that can still hold an intelligent conversation and can decide whether or not he wants sugar in his tea.
One of the things I found really interesting is that, with me being a wheelchair user, that seems to invite some people to be jumping into conversations that they probably wouldn't have with somebody who was non-disabled. And so I can be having a perfectly normal conversation with somebody. You bump into somebody at the supermarket. I was at Twickenham on Saturday, watching England thump Wales at the rugby, and I was chatting to the bloke next to me, and I knew what was going to happen, because it's just the way the conversation meandered a bit. And then he jumped in with, "So what happened to you? Why are you in a wheelchair?" And my temptation at that point is always to say, really none of your business, is it? That's quite a personal question to be asking someone. You don't even know my name, and yet you think I'm going to open up with my life story. But you wouldn't do that if you were sitting next to a non-disabled person. Or I find it really interesting that because I'm in a wheelchair, people think that means that all I want to do is talk about how I got here and what the journey is. And, I'm tempted sometimes to have a bit of fun with it. To say, have you signed the Official Secrets Act? Because if you haven't, I can't tell you. I'm sorry, it's a secret. Or
you think I'm bad, you should see the sharp. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. You know, you should have seen the three blokes who attacked me where they are. You know, all that sort of, you can have fun with it. But actually, a lot of the time, if I'm out and about and just wanting to be me, I don't want to be having that sort of conversation.
yeah,
And so, in terms of doing things better, every now and again, I'd like people to remember that I don't have a sign above my head saying, "Ask me how I got here,"
mm.
Yeah.
because I'm tempted to say, "Well, I drove, mate," because that's the way I get around, and then
Yeah. I think
And both of
that's an
you,
excellent point, Dave. I would echo that completely. If there was one thing to change, it's the just because you see somebody in a wheelchair, don't immediately within 5 minutes of the conversation ask them what happened to you. Then,
and both of you have talked about the fact that you've got families and stuff. I know that when I've been out with my dad, I've noticed that since he's been a wheelchair user, that people address the question to me rather than to my dad. So I happened to go into the bank with him. He needed to get some cash out, actually to pay people that were doing some work to convert his house to be more wheelchair accessible. And the way the woman behind the counter spoke, and only spoke to me, and when she did speak to my dad, it was as if my dad was 5 years old, not a man that had worked his entire life and had used an ATM before. Have either of you experienced that type of interaction?
a couple of times when I've been out with my partner and we've been, perhaps at a counter ordering some coffee or something, and I have had the classic, "Would he like sugar?" To which my partner takes no prisoners. Louise, bless her, she takes no prisoners at all. And she just looked this woman coldly in the eye and said, "I can't remember. Ask him." And that kind of got the message across.
I've had the same. Um, I'd been warned that it would happen.
Mm.
It was something that was talked about during the rehab I went through in terms of coming to terms with my injury and being a wheelchair user. But I was told that this would happen, and I remember exactly. I took my wife away for the weekend. It's the first time we'd been away since my injury. We went to Stratford for the weekend, just literally booked into a hotel, 24 hours away from the kids, and we went to the hotel restaurant, and the sort of the person doing the meeting and greeting said to my wife, "Will he be staying in his chair or will he be transferring into one of our chairs?" And my wife just burst into tears because she was still a long way from coming to terms with all of
Yeah.
this, and I just had to say to the lady that I'll be staying in my chair, and you can talk to me, and I'll understand what you're saying, and it will all be fine. Um, but it kind of rammed home the reality of how the my situation had changed, that the dynamics of me going to places had changed, the dynamics even in the relationship were changing. Um, so it was quite a moment that we then spent the rest of the evening talking about, which was a bit frustrating, but it was a big deal at that time, and it's happened a number of times since then, and uh, my wife Paula has got to the point where she'll now just say, "Well, ask him. He's right here next to
Yeah.
me."
I'd like to move on to sort of how accessible you both find, areas. So, how would you rate the sort of accessibility of public spaces?
It varies enormously. Um, like Dave, I was at Twickenham at the weekend. I think he saw a different game to me if he thinks that England thumped Wales, but I think we got through by the skin of our teeth, I think was the game I saw. I mean, we were sitting different sides of the pitch, but and places like that, accessibility I find is very, very good. I've been to several events at the London Stadium, for example, to see the athletics and baseball, and I haven't made myself suffer to watch West Ham play, but there's time yet. And that's excellent. And it's one of the things that I like about stadiums like that, and MK Dons is very, very similar, is that unlike Twickenham, although Twickenham does have some accessible seats that are higher up, you're not just at pitch side. The pitch is slightly sunk, and you can come in at half height, so that you would get that view as you would do if you were watching the events on TV. So I think sometimes a little bit of lateral thinking helps with forward planning on that. But if you're going to go to sort of the more general public areas, um, one of my bugbears living as I do, sort of out in the countryside a little bit, is a lot of the local pubs are very, very nice, but a lot of them have got gravel car parks, which means that by the time you've got from the car, even if you've parked as close as you possibly can to the gate or to the door or whatever, by the time you get in, you feel like you've done a workout in the gym. You're perhaps sweating a little bit, and that first pint goes down very, very quickly rather than actually being enjoyed and savoured as it should be. Um, and thinking about ramps and, because we put a slope in, a slope like that isn't a slope because you can't go there on your own. You'll either need somebody to give you a hand up or to hold you perhaps on the way back down so that you don't end up pitching forward and being sprawled in the gravel in the car park. The other thing I would say is some places will say, well, there's only one step into it. There's a pub just around the corner from me that I've contacted. I was thinking of going there to watch some sport one evening. Um, and I contacted them and said, how accessible are you? Well, there's only one little step into the pub. Okay. So that's one step too many, was my comment. I have got another example about accessible parking, but I'll let Dave have his say first.
Yeah, access is a really interesting one for me because um, I find it frustrating that I have shops local to me that I can't get into because they have steps going into them, and no effort's been made to make them accessible, despite things like the Equalities Act and the fact that I should be by right, by my rights, able to go anywhere. But then I can travel to London and I can go to Twickenham or I can go to Wembley or wherever it is, and they they take it much more seriously.
Mm.
And I think that it's improving, but it's improving at a snail's pace. Um, there there doesn't seem to be any, or I don't see much appetite for people to amend their premises to make them accessible, which is ridiculous when you think about the purchasing power that disabled people have. We work, and we get paid a salary, and if I can't come into your shop, then I won't be spending my salary with you. It's as simple as that. And so the lost market across the country, it would be billions because of that. And I think the other thing that I still find frustrating is every time I see a picture of a prime minister or a politician outside 10 Downing Street, I look at the two steps that they go into Downing Street and wonder why they haven't sent out a clear signal to the rest of the country that by making the seat of government accessible, then maybe we should make this local shop accessible as well. And there'll be some spurious nonsense reason to do with the fact that it's a listed building or security or blah, blah, which is all nonsense. It's all an excuse because there is no reason why, old buildings can't be made accessible. There are some brilliant examples up and down the country where people locally have made a building accessible, and they've done it in the right style and the right way, and it's sympathetic to the area or the building that's there. But if we can't even get the Prime Minister's house accessible, then I'm afraid my local takeaway is just not going to bother. And there'll still be two steps to get in there, and there probably will be until the day I die.
I'll give you a good example of old buildings being made accessible and differing attitudes. Louise and I went to Bath for a weekend a couple of years ago now, but it was pre-COVID, so yes, it's quite a while ago. And went and had a look round the Roman baths themselves, which I was able to get round. There's a lift down to the access area. You can get all around, get around the whole of the exhibition, and actually round the bath itself. And have to be slightly careful on the paving slabs because they're not exactly flat and level, but I could still get round. Anyway, so we did that. And then we went round and there's a restaurant, I think it's Sally Lunder's is the name of it, or something like that, but it's where the original Bath buns were made and are sold. And we wanted to go and have afternoon tea in there and a Bath bun. So and again, this was another one of these old type buildings, I don't know, 200-300 years old, but it had got a step down into the building. So we sort of knocked on the door and somebody came out and I said, look, have you got a ramp or something that we can get in? She said, oh no. She said, I'm really sorry. She said, this building's, I don't know, 250 years old. She said, we can't, it's not accessible. I went, oh, that's a shame. I said, I've just been to the Roman bars that are 2,000 years old and I was able to get round those and you can't get a ramp. Don't worry, we'll go elsewhere. And just walked away, or wheeled away in my case.
And you mentioned accessible parking, and you said, you've got a story there. But before you do, I think one of the things that I find fascinating about the British public is they can at times be the disability police. When people pull up in an accessible parking space, you can see people kind of, look around and sort of wait for that person to get out of their vehicle to determine whether they should be there or not, regardless of whether they've got a blue badge. What was the story that you wanted to share, Simon?
The story that I have is, well, it makes me sound like an alcoholic, but it's another one of my local pubs, actually. That during COVID, their accessible parking bays, because of the restrictions on pub access and social distancing and what have you, put picnic benches on the accessible parking spaces. Yeah, well, okay, I can live with that. But now that we're post-COVID, the benches are still on the disabled parking spaces. So it was one of the pubs that I know I can get into because there's level access into it. But I just couldn't park there to go in, and I wanted to go down and watch a football game of football with a couple of mates of mine. And I'd emailed them before and said, look, I noticed that your parking bench, that you've got picnic benches on the parking spaces. Are you going to move them? Are you going to move them elsewhere? Because obviously, you should be providing accessible parking for those of us who need it. And the response I got back was, this is private land. We are not obliged to provide disabled parking. We will be keeping the parking benches there. Needless to say, I haven't been back in the pub ever since, and nor have any of my mates.
Dave, you touched on Downing Street, which was a really interesting point that you just made. What could government and particularly local authorities do more of to make the UK a more accessible place for wheelchair users?
I was 41 when I became spinal cord injured, when I acquired my disability. And if I'd been working in local government, prior to that, I wouldn't have understood the needs of a full-time wheelchair user. Whether they were in a manual chair or a powered chair, I would not have really thought about it properly at that point. And so we were talking earlier about, somebody who thinks they understands my life because they've sat in a wheelchair when they broke their leg, for example, or something like that. But actually, in this instance, I'd really like somebody to spend 15 minutes, half an hour in a wheelchair, which I will happily provide. I have a spare chair, and just come for a walk with me. And we'll just go for, a few hundred yards in one direction and a few hundred yards back again. And they will then understand more about my life in that short walk than they would have done previously. They'll know about the camber that's on pavements so that they drain water away when it rains. They will understand about the tactile bumps that help people who have reduced vision or who are blind when you're trying to cross a road, and what that is then like for a wheelchair user when your legs are bouncing off your foot plate as you're trying to cross the road. They'll understand about curbs and the importance of having something that you can actually get up so that you're not trying to bounce over a big obstacle. They would understand that, as Simon has touched on, the fact that post-COVID, a lot of pubs and restaurants decided to put tables and chairs out on the pavement is all very well, but that's just more slaloming for me to do, assuming I can get past at all. And you can see that up and down the country. You doesn't have to be a big city you go to, doesn't have to be London, but that it's all there. And so I think I would like people in local government to try and understand more about the life that I lead, the life that Simon leads, and the obstacles that are in our way that stop us having the ability to get around and do things and spend money. And honestly, half an hour in a chair with me and people would understand things much better. Or working with colleagues in the charity we both work for, the Spinal Injuries Association. There's no excuse in 2023 for people who are making decisions to not understand the impact of the decisions they're making. There just isn't any excuse. There's so much information out there. There's so many places you can reach out to. There's so many people that you can talk to. And to not do any of those things and just make decisions in splendid isolation, well, ultimately, all it's doing is helping to make my life more difficult. And that's not what they're trying to do. They're supposed to be trying to make my life easier. So, come and spend half an hour, and then you'll know.
I recently went over to Belfast for a couple of nights with a mate of mine, and we were going around the city, and he messaged me after we got home just to sort of kind of say, yeah, thanks, excellent weekend, thoroughly enjoyed it. But he said, traveling around with you, he said, I saw a new city in a new light, because previously I hadn't thought about, is this surface cobbled? Are my feet, you look at things very, very differently. Is that slope too steep to go down? Am I going to be able to get down there okay? Or is it too steep to get up? If I'm crossing the road, there's a drop curb here, but is there one on the other side that I can get up? Do I need to find a slightly different route to get around somewhere because it's less steep, or the surface is less slippery, or there's not something in the way that I could squeeze past? It's things like that. And I think, as David said, rather than trying to guess what people in a wheelchair will need, ask someone in a wheelchair what they need, or what will work or what won't work. Most of us are very, very willing to give up our time or to give some advice, but ask us. We'll happily give you our opinion, because otherwise you'll only have us moaning at you when it doesn't go right.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, just picking up on what you've just said there, Simon, because I think since my dad's been using a wheelchair, when I'm out and about now, I am much more aware of that when I'm looking at things like, if I wanted to take my dad out for lunch, could he access this place, or book, a weekend away for him? Would he be able to access it? So I've got a different perspective now, because I have somebody in my family who that's their lived experience day to day. So I like what both of you are saying in terms of getting people in positions that are making these decisions to actually really talk to the people that are affected by that, to make the services that they provide more accessible. So how can non-disabled individuals be better allies to wheelchair users, do you think?
That's a really good question. If I was going to ask a non-disabled person one favor, it would be, don't park in the accessible spaces, even if you're only going to be a couple of minutes. Because don't sit in that space and say, well, if somebody wants it, I'll move. Because if I drive up to the car parking space, I don't know that you're prepared to move. If I'm going to ask you, I've got to pull my car over, get out into my wheelchair, come round to the driver's side and ask you, are you staying here, or are you going to move? Then go and repeat the whole process just so I can get into a parking space. That would be my one simple request. I have played naughty boys on one or two occasions when people have, well, I'm only going to be a couple of minutes, in which case I've then parked my car behind theirs so that they can't get out. And they've come up, well, are you going to move? Well, I'm only going to be a couple of minutes. If you've got a problem, go and see security inside the store, and we'll see whose side they take. But that's just me. If I'm in a particularly malicious mood, But yeah, that would be my one request.
I think for me,
And Dave?
yeah, I would like huge generalizations, but I would like people to be less fickle in the way that they are approaching this issue, because as you touched on earlier, Justin, people can get very, very on a soapbox when they think somebody's parking in a blue badge space that they're not entitled to park in, or that they're using a disabled toilet and they don't have a disability. And yet, despite the fact that they can be, a bit soapbox and a bit sanctimonious about those sorts of things, it doesn't stop them, the same people, using those facilities when it's convenient for them. And I find that sort of double standard quite interesting, really, because if people want to be allies, then they should be allies. They should be on our side, and that means not parking in a blue badge space if you're not a blue badge holder, and if you don't have a disability, visible or non-visible, then don't use an adapted toilet. It's things like that sometimes I think that people are happy to be allies as long as it's convenient for them. If it involves anything that looks like a degree of inconvenience for them, then no, maybe I'm less of an ally now. So either step up or don't. But don't flip between one and the other, because then that just doesn't work for me. And I think I've been in situations where it would have been helpful for people to speak up and support support me with what was going on, and people often choose not to do that, to raise their voice, or to say that something is unacceptable, or to question why you can get around the Roman ruins but not into a nearby pub. And it's just, I think that is what I would be looking for. Just that if you're going to have solidarity with disabled people, it's not an either or. You're either doing it or you're not.
I think what I would say on that is, don't treat us differently, treat us the same. That's, in a nutshell. Don't treat us differently because we're in a wheelchair. Treat us the same as you would do a non-disabled person. If a non-disabled person can get into your premises, make it so that a wheelchair person can get into your premises.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, Simon, it's been such a genuine pleasure to speak with both of you. I could spend another hour talking to you about your lived experiences. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And I think the work that both of you do at the Spinal Injuries Association is phenomenal. It was a genuine pleasure for us to come and work with your organisation a couple of years ago. It was a really unique experience for me to be training to a group of people that were a very large percentage of wheelchair users, because that doesn't happen very often. And, the insights and input that you've given today hopefully will help some of the organisations that we work with in the future, both whether that's local authority, government or private employers, just be a bit more considered in their approach to wheelchair users and to disabled people in general. So thank you both very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. You're very welcome,
Justin. And just if people want to learn more about the Spinal Injuries Association and the work that we do, the best place to start is probably our website, which is at www.spinal.co.uk, and a wealth of information there, and also contact details if you do want to get in touch.
Super. Dave, Simon, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Cheers now.
For more of our podcasts, visit our website at podcast.tedlearning.co.uk, or you can find us on most podcast platforms.